What if I told you that the largest statue in the world, standing tall for thousands of years, may not be what you think? What if its head wasn't carved by the pharaohs, but by a civilization long forgotten? What if there's a secret in its design, hidden beneath the sands? In this episode, we're unlocking one of the greatest mysteries of the ancient world. Where was the sun 10,000 years ago? And what's its connection to the constellation Leo? In 1990, under the blazing sun of Cairo, a strange man set foot in the land of ancient Egypt. He wasn't your typical researcher, but a geologist from Boston University named Robert Schoch. He walked with steady steps, as if searching for a hidden secret that had waited for him for thousands of years. His destination wasn't the pyramids like most visitors would choose. It was something deeper, something older. A colossal statue lying in eternal silence, bearing in its eyes a look that time itself could not decipher. The Sphinx. Robert came to study the stone creature from a purely geological perspective, unaware that the sands beneath his feet guarded secrets that only reveal themselves to those deemed worthy. At first, he accepted the conventional story that Pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BC, had commissioned its carving. But something about the statue, its majestic silence, its gaze fixed on the horizon, made Robert pause. Why were there no inscriptions on its body to tell who carved it or when it was born? What explained the deep erosion on its body? And why did its head seem disproportionately small, as if added later to a body not of this era? Where was the logic in the face of the genius of ancient Egyptian sculptors? The closer he looked, the more questions arose. His scientific investigation turned into a mysterious journey into the heart of history. When he examined the erosion patterns with the eyes of a geologist, he didn't see the effects of wind, but water, heavy rain, and storms not seen in Egypt for thousands of years, from a time when the desert was green and the land pulsed with life. And then, the earth whispered its truth to Robert. At the end of his journey, the man declared what sounded like a prophecy. The Sphinx does not belong to Khafre's time, but to an earlier era, a time lost beneath layers of forgetfulness. 10,000 years before Christ. From that moment, the Sphinx was no longer just a statue. It became a gateway to a mysterious civilization, a call from a distant past waiting to be deciphered. Time was hazy, and the sands whispered things no one could understand. The Sphinx, this mythical creature combining the body of a lion with the power of the earth, and the head of a man with the wisdom of the ages, sits in eternal silence beneath Egypt's sun, guarding a secret buried for thousands of years. It is not just a statue, but the largest and most massive ancient sculpture in the world, carved from a single rock, stretching 73 meters long and standing 20 meters tall, the same height as the White House. No stones were brought to it, it was born from the rock itself. Huge blocks were removed from around it, later forming the temples before it, as if they were designed to make it the master, and all else its court. And despite the passing centuries, the advance of science, and the many researchers who explored its depths, the Sphinx remains an unsolved mystery. No inscriptions on its body, no record of who carved it, nor when, nor why. Imagine this stone being staring into the horizon for thousands of years, waiting for someone to understand its language, waiting for the right question to be asked. Let the journey begin. Let's return to the beginning, where the secret was born, before civilizations were written, before myths were drawn, before the name Sphinx was ever spoken. Before Robert Schoch appeared, there was a sign. In the 1980s, while humanity was busy with the age of technology and progress, one man was walking against the current. John Anthony West, an independent researcher who defied tradition, passionate about uncovering the history of ancient civilizations, and convinced that secrets had been lost amid the noise of modern science. One night, he found himself reading a strange book, written by a Frenchman named Schwaller de Lubicz, with a provocative title, The Sacred Science. In its pages, John paused at a sentence that wasn't ordinary. It was a signal. The erosion on the Sphinx's body was caused by water, not wind, as Egyptologists believe. Water? In Egypt, the desert climate hadn't seen rainfall in thousands of years. So how could the statue erode like this? There was only one answer. The Sphinx existed during the Rainy Age, an ancient, forgotten era dating back to before 700 BC, when Egypt was green and alive. But there was one problem. John wasn't a geologist, and he lacked the scientific weapon needed to prove his theory. All he had was his intuition, and a deep sense that a great secret was waiting to be revealed. His quest didn't begin in the desert, but in labs and universities, searching for a man who could read stone as one reads books. And there he found him, Dr. Robert Schoch, geology professor at Boston University, a specialist in erosion and rock analysis. But John didn't tell him about the Sphinx right away. Instead, he showed him a picture of a rock and slyly asked, "In your opinion, is this erosion caused by water or wind?" Robert looked at the picture. Without hesitation, he answered confidently, "This erosion is from water, definitely." At that moment, John smiled quietly and revealed the truth. This isn't just any rock. It's the body of the Sphinx. Silence fell. A brief moment, yet it carried with it shock, confusion, and a thrill that made Robert question. Had everything he learned throughout his life been incomplete? Could the Sphinx be older than we think? It wasn't long before Robert agreed to travel to Egypt with John. He sensed that something extraordinary was waiting beneath the sands, something not of this era, but from a forgotten time when the sky rained secrets, not water. Robert Schoch arrived at Giza as the sun was sinking behind the Great Pyramid, casting long shadows over the mysterious face of the Sphinx, as if telling him that this visitor was unlike any who came before. Schoch approached the statue, not looking at the face or the eyes, but focusing instead on what others ignored: the body of the Sphinx, the grooves, the curves, the deep erosions that cut through the stone like dried tears. To him, this wasn't an artistic miracle, but a geological report carved over thousands of years. Schoch read the rock as one would read an ancient manuscript, and every line told one story. It rained here, a lot, and with that, the truth appeared like the sun behind the clouds. This stone wasn't only exposed to sandstorms, but to a long, repeated, violent washing by water falling from the sky. This completely contradicted the official history, which dates the Sphinx's construction to around 2500 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. But where did this rain come from? And when was the last time such rain fell in this region? Here began a deeper journey. A journey into the heart of the Mousterian pluvial period, dating back between 10,000 and 7,000 BC, a time before the dynasties, before the pharaohs ever existed, when Egypt was a green savanna, teeming with animals, humans, and perhaps a civilization we know nothing about. And so, the Sphinx suddenly became not just a statue, but a tombstone for a lost civilization. The second step was Robert Schoch's study of the Sphinx enclosure walls to uncover further evidence supporting his theory. It's well known that the Sphinx was carved directly from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, making it appear as if it sits in a trench or basin. Archaeologists have traditionally attributed the erosion on these walls to wind. But for geologists, the difference between the two types of erosion is significant. Why? When wind erodes stone, it strips away the softer layers while leaving the harder layers intact. This results in horizontal weathering, creating flat or linear patterns across surfaces exposed to wind over millennia. This type of erosion is common across many ancient Egyptian sites. But erosion caused by rainwater is entirely different. Water doesn't form horizontal lines, but instead creates vertical, rounded grooves, channels formed as water seeps through cracks and cavities in rock over thousands of years. These grooves are among the clearest indicators of prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. And when Schoch examined the walls surrounding the Sphinx, He found that the erosion was vertical and rounded, indicating that water, not wind, was responsible. This became his second piece of geological evidence supporting the idea that the Sphinx dates back to a period when Egypt's climate was drastically different. Instead of a barren desert, it was lush and rainy, ideal conditions for this type of water erosion to occur. But the shock didn't stop there. Schock's team pursued additional evidence, which led to the next step: seismic studies conducted around the Sphinx. The seismic study referenced was conducted in the early 1990s, led by geologist Dr. Robert Schock of Boston University, in collaboration with geophysicist Thomas DeBakey. Their findings were published in the journal Geoarchaeology in 1992, under the title, Seismic Investigations in the Vicinity of the Great Sphinx of Giza, Egypt. The goal of this study was to determine the condition of the bedrock beneath the Sphinx. They inserted 4 sensors around the body of the Sphinx. They then struck a metal plate to generate sound waves that traveled into the ground and bounced back to the surface. By measuring the speed of these returning sound waves, they could determine the density and integrity of the rock below. The result was shocking. The study revealed a layer of eroded limestone extending from the surface down to a depth ranging between 1.2 and 2.5 meters, with variations in depth across different parts of the statue. Schock interpreted this variation as evidence that different parts of the statue were subjected to erosion during different time periods, suggesting that the statue might be much older than commonly believed. Such depth of erosion could not have occurred from just 20 or 30 years of rainfall. No, the rain must have fallen heavily for hundreds, or perhaps even thousands of years. This became a new central point supporting his hypothesis that the erosion wasn't limited to the body and the surrounding enclosure walls. Even the rocks beneath the Sphinx had been eroded due to prolonged rainfall. This doesn't align with a desert climate. It calls for a rainy one. This mythical creature isn't alone in this mysterious scene. Beside it stand 2 temples, one called the Sphinx Temple, and the other known as the Valley Temple. These temples seem like wings of ancient secrets that humans have yet to fully comprehend. These 2 temples were constructed using unusual stones that carry an undiscovered history. They were quarried from the very site where the Sphinx itself was carved. The mystery lies not only in their origin but in the type of erosion they display. When researchers examine these stones, they notice they bear the same signs of water erosion, identical to those on the Sphinx's body. Robert Schock presented 4 geological pieces of evidence: erosion patterns on the Sphinx's body, seismic studies beneath the Sphinx, erosion on the stones of the Sphinx and Valley temples, fissures in the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. There are other pieces of evidence that will be discussed in future episodes, but for now, these 4 are the key. Geology concluded that the Sphinx had witnessed an era of heavy rainfall, and its actual age dates back to somewhere between 700 to 11,000 BCE. As for the kings of the dynastic period, they simply reused it. The hypothesis proposed by Dr. Robert Schock is purely geological. So, if you want to respond or criticize it, don't accuse him of trying to distort Egyptian history, because he's speaking from a geological standpoint, and any rebuttal must also be geological. Here, another man steps onto the stage, one of the foremost experts in earth sciences, Egyptian scientist Dr. Farouk Elbaz, a professor of remote sensing at Boston University and a colleague of Robert Schock in a scientific journey resembling a search for truth through a fog of legends. Despite his vast knowledge, Dr. Farouk remained committed to the traditional narrative taught by Egyptologists, that the Sphinx was carved around 2500 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. Nevertheless, he did not deny the presence of erosion. Instead, he tried to give it a down-to-earth explanation, one that wouldn't threaten the chronological framework built by modern civilization. He suggested that the erosion might be due to groundwater accumulating from repeated Nile floods, raising the water table over many years and causing the Sphinx enclosure to fill up, resulting in the observed erosion. It was an elegant theory, seemingly logical, but truth does not always bend to logic. Then came Dr. Robert Schock, the geologist who reads rocks the way priests read the stars, and he responded swiftly. Standing before the enclosure wall, he pointed to the erosion pattern, from top to bottom. Not bottom to top, as would be expected if groundwater were the cause. If it were groundwater, Schock said confidently, the erosion would have started from below. But here, we see it descending from the top, as if tracing the path of rainfall. And Schock didn't stop there. He turned his attention to the stones of the two temples in front of the Sphinx, massive blocks rising 4 to 5 meters high. Does it make sense that Nile floods reach this height? He asked, as if the question carried its own answer. There was no rational explanation for the erosion of these massive blocks except that they had been exposed to intense and prolonged rainfall. Thus, the traditional narrative began to shake, not at the hands of a conspirator or skeptic, but through evidence drawn from the heart of stone, from stony faces no longer able to conceal their ancient truths. If the Sphinx is 7,000 years old, who carved it? According to mainstream Egyptology, the Great Sphinx was carved by Pharaoh Khafre, the ruler of Egypt's 4th dynasty. This theory is widely accepted, and it's based on two main points. A statue of Khafre was discovered in the Valley Temple, near the Sphinx. So, archaeologists concluded that he must have built both the temple and the Sphinx. The face of the Sphinx is believed to resemble Khafre. Based on these two arguments, Egyptologists have long assumed that the Sphinx represents Khafre himself.
All Egyptologists, and especially everyone who studied the Sphinx, and all the archaeological evidence that we have, dated the Sphinx back to 4,500 years ago, which is the time of Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid at Giza.
But let's take a closer look and question these assumptions. Point 1. Just because a statue of Khafre was found near the Sphinx doesn't necessarily mean he carved it. Correlation doesn't always mean causation. Point 2. Not everyone agrees that the Sphinx looks like Khafre. One notable skeptic was John Anthony West, who sought scientific evidence to challenge this belief. He enlisted the help of Frank Domingo, a seasoned forensic expert from the New York Police Department, specializing in facial analysis. Domingo traveled to Egypt with official permits and conducted a detailed examination of the Sphinx's face, comparing it to the statue of Khafre housed in the Egyptian Museum. The results were surprising. The Sphinx's eyes were found to be significantly wider, and its mouth was broader than Khafre's. Khafre's face, in contrast, appeared narrower and more refined. Even the facial angles, like the jawline and the distance between the chin and eyes, were markedly different. Ancient Egyptian sculptors were known for their precision. When they carved a statue of a pharaoh, they captured every facial detail with remarkable accuracy. Take Akhenaten's statues or Tutankhamun's golden mask, both are nearly identical to their actual features. So if Khafre truly commissioned the Sphinx, why do the facial features differ so drastically? Inside the Egyptian Museum, in the very room where Khafre's statue stands, there is a lesser-known artifact, the inventory stela. At first glance, it seems unremarkable, but its message could shake the foundations of traditional Egyptology. The stela claims that Pharaoh Khufu, Khafre's grandfather, carried out restoration work at the Giza Plateau. One particular line stands out. It says Khufu repaired and adorned the Great Sphinx. Wait, repaired? That would mean the Sphinx existed before Khufu. If true, this would push the monument's age back by at least a full generation, possibly much more. German archaeologist Dr. Brugsch was one of the first to point out this detail. For him, the stela was clear evidence that Khufu had seen the Sphinx with his own eyes. Therefore, Khafre couldn't have been the original builder. However, some scholars dismiss this claim, saying the stela dates back to Egypt's 26th dynasty, nearly 2,000 years after Khufu's reign. But does that completely discredit it? Not necessarily. The stela was still written by ancient Egyptians, and it's likely based on even older records that were lost over time. Nevertheless, mainstream Egyptologists continue to reject its content, mainly because it doesn't support the Khafre narrative. Now take a look at the Sphinx from the side. You'll notice something strange. The head is disproportionately small compared to the body, oddly so. If you compare it to other Sphinx statues in the Egyptian Museum, you'll see they are all well-proportioned and elegant. But the Giza Sphinx? It looks unbalanced, as if something's not right. This led John Anthony West and geologist Dr. Robert Schoch to propose a radical theory. The original head of the Sphinx eroded over time and was later recarved, perhaps multiple times, by rulers from later periods. Because they had to carve the new head from what was left of the original limestone block, the result was a much smaller head, giving the statue its bizarre proportions. And here comes the strangest observation of all. The head of the Sphinx is in relatively good condition, even though it's the highest point, and should have suffered the most damage from wind and rain. Logically, it should be the most eroded part. Yet the opposite is true. The body is far more weathered, especially the back and the surrounding walls of the Sphinx enclosure. This leads to a chilling possibility. The current head isn't original. Some researchers believe the Sphinx may have originally had the head of a lion, not a human face. To this day, no one knows for sure who the Sphinx's face is meant to represent. But one thing is certain. Something changed, and what was lost might be the key to unlocking the true mystery of the Sphinx. Like many ancient Egyptian monuments, the Sphinx has undergone multiple phases of restoration. During the New Kingdom and later under the Ptolemies and Romans, efforts were made to preserve it. Even in the last century, modern restorations have continued, and you can still see newly added stones on its body today. But here's a crucial point. Restoration does not equal creation. Just because the 4th dynasty may have repaired the statue doesn't mean they built it. Renowned Egyptologist Dr. Salim Hassan once noted that the Roman historian Pliny the Elder believed the Sphinx predated the dynastic period entirely, belonging to a mysterious era known as the followers of Horus. Even Gaston Maspero, the founding father of modern Egyptology, once wrote, "The Great Sphinx was the guardian of the northern horizon, since the time of the followers of Horus." This phrase, followers of Horus, refers to a shadowy epoch believed to have existed before the pharaohs. Some researchers think it was a real prehistoric civilization. Others dismiss it as myth. But if the Sphinx truly dates back to that time, then we're not just rewriting the history of Egypt, we're redefining the origins of civilization itself. There's also an ancient legend tied to the Sphinx. One day in ancient Egypt, a young prince went hunting near the Giza Plateau. Exhausted by the desert heat, he lay down in the shadow of a massive stone lion, the Great Sphinx, and fell asleep. In his dream, the Sphinx spoke to him, "Clear away the sand that covers me, and you shall become king." That prince would later become Pharaoh Thutmose IV. True to his word, he cleared the sand and built a protective wall around the Sphinx. To commemorate the event, he carved the story into a granite stele placed between the Sphinx's paws. Today, we call it the Dream Stele. But here's where things get strange. If you look closely at the stele's carvings, it seems to depict two sphinxes, not just one. Could it be? Was there once a twin sphinx? In ancient Egypt, sphinx statues often came in pairs, lining both sides of sacred roads, like the Avenue of the Rams between Karnak and Luxor. Even at Pompey's Pillar in Alexandria, twin sphinxes are present. In 1920, British Egyptologist Flinders Petrie studied the Dream Stele and asked the question, what if there really was a twin? Driven by this possibility, he turned away from the Great Sphinx and walked in a perfectly straight line westward, across the Nile, through the fields of Madi, all the way to the edge of the eastern desert. He searched everywhere, but he found nothing. Egyptologist Dr. Bassam el-Shama also delved into this enigma, proposing a possible location for a second sphinx, based on his communications with NASA. NASA had sent him satellite imagery of the area surrounding the Giza Plateau, and what those images revealed was fascinating. A large carved stone formation, possibly man-made, though inconclusive. This discovery led Dr. el-Shama to theorize that a second sphinx may be buried at this site. He published a book titled The Second Sphinx, documenting all the evidence and satellite images provided by NASA. But unfortunately, the project was abandoned. Why? Because excavation permits were not granted. In response, Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's most prominent archaeologist, stated that he had already excavated that area and found nothing. So the question remains, is there a second Sphinx buried beneath the sands? Or is it all just speculation? In our earlier discussion, we explored Robert Bauval's Orion theory, his belief that the pyramids were aligned with the Orion constellation and that they date back to 10,500 BCE, during what is known as the Age of Leo. But the story doesn't end there. Bauval also believed in the existence of a second Sphinx. He just didn't know where to look. One of the ancient names for the Sphinx is Hor-em-Akhe, Horus in the horizon. That phrase caught Bauval's attention. If the Sphinx is Horus, he reasoned, then it must be aligned with the horizon with something celestial. So Bauval returned to his astronomical models, rewinding the night sky back to 10,500 BCE. What he saw shocked him. He immediately called his friend Graham Hancock. "You won't believe this. I found the second Sphinx in the stars." What he discovered was astonishing. In 10,500 BCE, the constellation Leo, the lion, rose directly on the eastern horizon, right in front of the Great Sphinx. Now think about it. The Sphinx is a lion, symbolizing power, majesty, and the heavens. Perhaps it wasn't just a statue. Perhaps it was a celestial marker. And when Bauval examined the pyramids, he found they aligned perfectly with Orion's belt as it appeared in 10,500 BCE. At that time, Orion's belt matched the layout of the three main pyramids. The Milky Way aligned with the Nile River. This wasn't coincidence. It was a celestial blueprint. But here's the problem. In 2500 BCE, when mainstream Egyptology claims the Sphinx was built, the Leo constellation was nowhere near the horizon. So when the Sphinx gazes to the east, it's not watching the sunrise. It's staring at its own reflection in the stars. To Bauval, this was even more evidence of a deep astronomical connection between the Giza Plateau and the skies of 10,500 BCE, a time that seems to open a window into a forgotten epoch. According to Bauval, the entire Giza complex was designed as a mirror of the heavens. Think about that. The Nile River mirrors the Milky Way. The three pyramids reflect the three stars in Orion's belt. And the Sphinx? It aligns with Leo, the celestial lion. This isn't just ancient architecture, it's a model of the cosmos. A part of the Great Year, a 26,000-year astronomical cycle where the heavens slowly rotate, repeating their alignment every few millennia. But we still can't be certain. So much remains undiscovered. In fact, even moving ancient monuments has become controversial because we may lose the cosmic logic behind their placement. Perhaps the ancients chose these sites for reasons deeply tied to astronomy. And if we alter them, we risk severing that ancient knowledge forever. And so, Robert Bauval's theory converges with that of Dr. Robert Schoch, that the Sphinx and pyramids may in fact date back to 10,500 BCE. These astronomical alignments could be the key to understanding a lost civilization and why its secrets vanished. In the early 1990s, Robert Schoch, a geologist, not an Egyptologist, proposed a radical hypothesis that the Great Sphinx was far older than traditionally believed. The academic world exploded in controversy. Dr. Mark Lehner, a leading Egyptologist, dismissed Schoch's team as ignorant, claiming their theory contradicted decades of established research. Meanwhile, Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's most recognizable archaeologist, called it American hallucination, insisting there was no evidence that the Sphinx predated the Old Kingdom. But Schoch didn't back down. As a geologist, he saw deep weathering patterns on the Sphinx, erosion caused not by wind or sand, but by heavy rainfall. Rain that hadn't fallen on the Giza Plateau since before 5000 BCE. He published books like Voices of the Rocks and Origins of the Sphinx, in which he joined forces with Robert Bauval, suggesting that both the pyramids and the Sphinx might date back to 10,500 BCE. representing celestial alignments and a legacy from a lost civilization. Still, not everyone was convinced.
If it was built by a civilization or a culture that is that much earlier, where is the other evidence of this culture? Show me a potsherd, show me a tomb, show me an inscription, show me any other piece of sculpture, show me any archaeological site that dates to this period.
That this civilization is lost for a reason. It existed before 10,000 BCE, and all we have left of it are fragments, megaliths, and mysteries. They called it the lost civilization waiting to be rediscovered. Historians argue there was no known civilization in Egypt that far back. To which Bauval and Schoch replied, "Exactly. That's why it's lost." Ancient Egyptian tradition even speaks of a time before the pharaohs, a mythical age known as the Age of the Gods. Horus, the falcon-headed god and son of Isis and Osiris, was the last of these divine rulers. When he stepped down, he handed the throne to a line of powerful kings called the followers of Horus, or the Shemsu-Hor. Some researchers believe these were the true builders of the pyramids and the Sphinx. Not the dynastic pharaohs, but the mysterious kings of a forgotten golden age. We don't know exactly when they ruled. The Turin King list, an ancient papyrus, mentions them, but the numbers are missing or damaged. Still, early historian Eusebius, quoting Manetho, claimed these kings ruled for over 5,000 years before the First Dynasty. This clash of ideas sparked a divide in modern Egyptology. Two competing schools of thought emerged. One, the official view, championed by university professors, museum curators, and scholars like Zahi Hawass, Mark Lehner, Rainer Stadelman, Bob Breyer, and Salima Ikram. They believe Egypt's civilization began around 3,500 BCE, that the pharaohs of the dynastic period were the ones who built the pyramids, temples, and obelisks, using primitive tools, hammers, chisels, sleds, and wooden ramps. They say Egypt declined gradually, weakened by invasions, corruption, and time, until it faded under the rule of the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. 2. The alternative view, promoted by authors and researchers like Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, Christopher Dunn, Robert Bauval, and Robert Schoch, and now many Egyptian scholars too. They offer geological, astronomical, and technical evidence suggesting that something crucial is missing from mainstream history. They argue that Egypt's golden age occurred between 10,000 and 12,000 BCE. This advanced civilization had knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and engineering beyond our current understanding. They built the pyramids, the Sphinx, and massive temples not with primitive tools, but with technology we have yet to rediscover. And that Egypt's downfall wasn't gradual, it was sudden, triggered by a cataclysm. The signs are everywhere: collapsed temples, shattered statues, megaliths scattered like dominoes. Tourists often ask, why is everything broken? Maybe the real question should be, what happened to the world that built them? Clearly, the ending was never what we expected. This was never just about the Hyksos or the Persians or any foreign invasion. There are signs, 3 powerful clues, that something far more catastrophic took place. First, the presence of countless unfinished structures, abandoned engineering marvels, incomplete pyramids, and coffins left half-carved or misplaced, as if those who were building them simply ran out of time. Second, the sudden loss of knowledge. We once built pyramids and obelisks with stunning precision. Then, without warning, we forgot how. We no longer understood their purpose, or how such structures were even possible. And third, the silence in the records. An entire chapter of history gone. What happened? In upcoming episodes, we'll explore these mysteries in depth, one by one. Of course, the alternative school of thought is constantly under fire. Critics accuse it of distorting the official narrative. But here's the thing, their arguments aren't wild fantasies. They're built on evidence, logic, and reason. Since childhood, we've read, heard, and memorized the traditional version of Egyptian history. But maybe it's time to listen to the other side, to hear what they have to say, and to understand how they think. Because history is not just about what we know. It's about what we've forgotten. Robert Schoch said it was the rain that proved the statue is unbelievably old. But if the statue is older than civilization itself, then who are we? Share your theory in the comments, and let's see who gets closest to the truth. And if you've made it this far, maybe it's time to stop being just a viewer and start uncovering the truth with us. See you in the next episode.